Gittin Daf Ayin Ches contains two Mishnayos, three sugyas. The first one continues the Gemara's discussion about where a husband can throw his wife's get. That could be konoi to her, that she could acquire it. Gemara is going to discuss the sugya of Kalov Shalokach B'Shus Meicher, where the person who's receiving it is receiving it in an object that he owns, but it is in the property of the person who's giving it, whether that works or not, and how that applies to a get. Now, first Mishnah will talk about he has to communicate to her that he's giving a get, can't be a secret, can't fool her into it. And then the next Mishnah, which will introduce the topic of what happens if it's thrown and it's not clear if it's closer to her or closer to him. So let's begin. The Gemara has said that if the husband and the wife are together in the bed and he throws for the get over there, then it's not konoi to her because it's in his property. So Gemara quotes Rava, who says that's only if it was his bed because the get is falling in his property. But if it would be her bed, then she would be divorced if the get lands in her bed. Gemara quotes Bryce that says that as well. Rabbi Elazar says the same halacha. So Gemara asks why. Although it's her bed, the bed is a kli, and the room that it's in, presumably, is their house, which belongs to the husband. If you're trying to transfer ownership of something to someone and you put it in his kli, but it's in your property, does his kli have the ability to be kind of for him in your property, or do we say, look, the kli is only here with your permission and therefore it doesn't count as if he has ownership of the airspace of the kli? You really own the airspace of the kli because it's in your property. So what would we view this over here? So the Gemara says, well, since Rava and Rabbi Eliezer are telling me that in her bed it would be kind of for him, even though it's a husband's house, seems to be saying that the kalim of the purchase that you can receive with your kli being in the property of the one who's trying to give it to you. So the Gemara answer is not necessarily. We could be talking about where the bed is a separate rishus, and therefore it has its own independent airspace, and it would be a separate rishus if it's 10 tefachim high. Someone says, well, what about the place of the legs? Because the legs are in the property of the owner of the house, which is in this case the husband. It doesn't get its own rishus. It's only there with his permission. Someone says people don't care about the space of legs. They can use the space under it if it's that high, and therefore it's no problem. You can't say that it is the airspace is the rishus of the husband. Next case in the Mishnah was if he throws it into her lap or into her basket. So the Gemara wants to know, how does it work if it's in her basket? Again, it's her kalim, but it's in the husband's rishus. Again, the airspace belongs to the husband. Someone gives a number of answers here. Yehuda and Shmuel says that it's hanging from her, that it's hanging around her neck or something, and therefore it is considered to be on her person, so it's not the husband's rishus. Rabbi Elazar says the same thing. Rabbi Oishia says that as well. Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish says it has to be tied to her, but it doesn't have to be actually hanging from her, just tied to her. Rabbi Ava says that it was between her legs, that she's sitting on the floor, and it's between her legs, not that she's holding it, but that she's sitting around it, and a person is not makbid on the place in which his wife sits. That does not count as being his own personal airspace. Then the Gemara gives another pshat of Masharshi Bar of Dimi, says that the husband was a basket seller, and therefore he doesn't care about the place of the baskets, he has baskets all over the place. Rabbi Yochanan says her lap belongs to her, and her basket belongs to her, and the place in which they are belong to her. Her husband gives that over to his wife, the space in which her lap or her basket are. Says Rava, what's pshat in Rabbi Yochanan in this halacha? Because people don't care about the place where their wife have their basket or lap. And Merkot Sarbaisa says this as well. If he throws it to her and lands in her lap or in her basket, or to anything else which is like a basket, then the divorce is chal. What is included by anything else like a basket? That's include a bag that she has, or that she eats the dates out of the bag. And here again, this clearly shows that the issue is the hakpada, and he's not makbid. Now we get the next Mishnah, and this discusses if he gives it to her without telling her that it's a get, and then he tells her later. And the question will be, and this will be a machlekes tanaim, the question will be, does it help to tell her later, or is it too late? She has to know at the time that he gives it to her. So the Mishnah first establishes the halacha that he has to communicate to her that it is a get. The Mishnah brings a number of cases here. If he gives her a piece of paper and he says, here is a loan document, or she finds it on his back and she takes it, then she reads it, and lo and behold, it's not a loan document, it's a get written to her. So this doesn't count as a get until he goes ahead and he says to her, this is your get. Now, if he puts it in her hand while she's asleep, and then she wakes up and she reads it, it's also, and then she finds out that it is a get. Again, it's not a get until he tells her, here's your get. So either way, he has to tell her it's your get. But the Mishnah seems to say it's enough if he tells her after she's already received it. So Mara asks, what does that help? It's like she's taking the get off the ground. At the time that she received it, it wasn't a get. Now she already has it, it turns into a get. It's like he says to her, pick up the get from the ground. There is no nesina, there's no act of giving in a way that completes the divorce. So that you need to have that. So that's a question the Gemara asks. So the Gemara says, she pulls it off his back. So that solves the problem as to how it helps if she found it on his back, but again, there's no nesina. So the Gemara says no, because he leaned it toward her. And the Gemara quotes a brisa that says as well that if he says, "Here is a loan document," or she pulls it off his back and she reads it and it's a get, it doesn't count as a get until he says, "Here's your get." And the question is, when can you say it? So according to Rebbe, he could say it at that point. According to Shimon ben Elazar, he can only say it until he's giving it to her or while he's giving it to her. Later, it doesn't help. What he can do is take it back from her and give it to her again, and then say, here's your get, as he gives it to her. Now, this brisa also brings the case of when she's sleeping, and it brings the same machlokes. If he puts it in her hand while she's asleep, it's no good. According to Rebbe, he could say afterwards, that was your get. According to Shimon ben Elazar, he has to take it back, give it to her again, and say, here's your get. And everyone wants to know, why do we have to discuss the case of her being told that it's a shtar chayiv and her receiving when she was sleeping? The Gemara says the case of the sleeping is a bigger chiddush, because a sleeping person can't be divorced. She's incapable of divorce at that moment. So you may think that Rebbe would agree that you have to give it back. You have to do the nesina over again, and therefore you have to mention that case to show that Rebbe agrees even there. And if you only said that case, you would know that Rebbe argues there, but you would have to show that Reb Shimon says in the other case, in the case where he gives it to her, and he says that it's a get, and there she's capable of divorce, you may think that Reb Shimon would agree that that case you won't have to do the nesina over again, and that's why we have to say that case. Again, one for the chiddush of Rebbe, one for the chiddush of Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar. Now, the Gemara says another halacha, which we've seen before. It's been brought earlier in the Masechta, and it's been brought in Kiddushin. So the Gemara says that Rava says if she writes again and puts it in the hand of her Eved, who is asleep and she is watching him. So Rava says that works because it's a chatzar mishnameres. The Eved counts as a chatzar, counts as a yard, and she is in control of him because he's asleep. The Gemara asks, she may be in control, but he's a movable chatzar, and the halacha is that a movable chatzar, a moving chatzar, does not make a kinyan. And the Gemara says, maybe he'll tell me, well, when he's asleep, he's not counted as movable. So that's not true, because Rava says separately, anyone who could move, but happens to not be moving now, still called a moving chutzner, and therefore it doesn't work. So the Gemara answers, he must be tied up. We now begin the second Mishnah on the Daf, and this introduces the topic of a person's personal space in Rishus Harabim, in the public domain, that is coniform. We have a halacha, which we've said that the floor space around a person is considered to be his rishus, even if he's standing in the public domain. And the question is, when can that be used to be a get or some other object that's being given to someone? So we shall see generally it's limited to one's 4 amos, that is a radius of 4 amos all around him. And the Gemara is going to show that it's not possible, that is possibly not unanimous here. So let's begin the Mishnah. So the Mishnah says, if husband and wife are standing in Rishus Harabim and he throws her the get. So you have 3 possibilities. The Mishnah and the Gemara is going to have machloks in defining what these are exactly. But what the Mishnah says is if it falls closer to her, she's divorced. Closer to him, she's not divorced. Half and half, then she's suffix divorced, is what we call megoreshes ve'ena megoreshes. She has to go l'chumra both ways. There's the Mishnah. Same thing applies as if he's throwing her kiddushin, or if someone owes money to someone else, and let's say somebody owes a loan, and the lender says, throw me the money. He throws it to him, and before he gets the chance to pick it up, it gets destroyed. So the same thing applies if the kedushin or if the money is repaid. If it lands closer to the receiver, then it's considered to be paid. The woman's mekudeshes, the man received his money and it's his loss. If it's closer to the thrower, then it's not received and it's his responsibility. And if it's halfway, then you split the money in the case of the loan, and they each get half. The Gemara wants to know, what does it mean close to him, closer to her? What exactly is, what do you mean by closer? The Gemara is going to have a number of different opinions in the Amoraim as to what this means. Rav is the first one. Rav says closer means within the 4 amas. So if it falls within her 4 amas, then she's megareshes. That's called close to her. If it falls within his 4 amas, and he never leaves his 4 amas, that's close to him, and she's not divorced. And what does it mean, half and half? So here, within this opinion of Rav, you have some opinions. Shmuel Bar Yitzchak says that they were standing in overlapping 4 amas. That is, they were closer together than 8 amas apart. Let's say they were standing 6 amas apart, so the middle 2 amas overlaps for both of them, and it landed in that middle 2 amas zone. So Gemara interrupts. The Gemara says, hold on a second. But whoever stood in the place first is kaineh his 4 amma or his or her 4 amma radius. First person comes later doesn't get the 4 ammas because it already is considered to be the rishos of the one who stood there first. So why don't we just see who got there first? So Gemara says no, because you can't tell. They both came at about the same time. You can't tell who was there first. Now, so the Gemara therefore brings another approach. That's Rav Kahana. He says no, half and half means that they're standing in exactly 8 amas apart, and therefore there's one thin line which is the border between his 4 amas and her 4 amas, and they get land on that line, straddling the line. Half of it sticks into his 4 amas, half of it sticks into her 4 amas, and that's a case of a suffix. So Gemara asks that shouldn't be correct. That should be for sure not divorced because the get never left him. In order for it to go to her, it has to make a complete break from his rishus at some point, and it never did that, so the get would not be chal. For Rabbi and Rav Yosef, therefore give a different shot. They say no, the case of half and half is where we have an argument as to what happened. So you have 2 witnesses who say that it landed closer to him, and 2 witnesses say it landed closer to her, and therefore we don't know, and therefore it's a suffix. Now Rav Yochanan gives a different shot altogether than what it means closer to him, closer to her. Rav Yochanan says it doesn't matter how close it lands. It doesn't matter within 4 amas or out of 4 amas. If it's closer to her than to him, she's divorced. It's closer to him than to her, she's not divorced, even if they're hundreds of miles apart. Now, the key point there is who has greater control over it. So therefore, the definition of half and half is where their control is equal. So Shemen Bar Abba defines that. In the name of Rav Yochanan, he says if he can control it, then it's considered to be in his rishus. If she can control it, it's going to be her rishus. If neither of them can, or if both of them can, that's the case of half and half, where you have a suffix. Now, this trial is set over in the name of Rabbi Yochanan. The Gemara now the Gemara relates that the Rabbanan said this over to Rabbi Yochanan in the name of Rabbi Yonasan, who was from Vavel before he moved to Eretz Yisrael. And Rabbi Yochanan praised the Pshat. He said, I see the Talmid Chachamim in Vavel know how to say Pshat, and they say a Pshat like this. And it's a brisa that shows this as well. Again, stressing that the idea is who can guard it, who can protect the get, not necessarily who is physically closer. So the brisa says, Rabbi Eliezer says, any time it's closer to her than to him, and a dog comes and takes it, she's not divorced. Gemara says, what does that mean? If it felt closer to her than to him, she's divorced. Who cares if a dog takes it afterwards? So Gemara says, what it means is as follows. Even if it's closer to her than to him, but he could stop a dog, and she can't stop the dog, like for example, there's a river between her and the get, and there's no river between him and the get, even though it's closer to her. So since he could protect it and she can't, that's not called divorce, because it's within his zone of protection and not within hers. Now, the Gemara brings one final pshat in the Mishnah as to what does it mean closer to her. So it says that Shmuel said to Rav Yehuda, he said sharp one, Shinana, that's how he referred to him, that close to her means that she could reach down, she could lean over and take it from the ground. And then he said, although that's the halacha, you should not paskan halacha l'maisa that she's divorced with the get until it actually gets to her hand. Don't paskan until it reaches her hand. Always go l'chumra. So Gemara says that Rav Mordechai said to Rav Ashi, it was an incident that happened, and they required her to do a chalitza. It had reached closer to her, but it didn't get to her hand, and then her husband died first, and they said she requires a chalitza to be machmer that it wasn't a get yet. Gemara now refers back to Mishnah, where he had seen that the Mishnah says that the same halacha of close to him, close to her applies for kedushin and for repaying a loan. Gemara quotes Rav Asi and Rav Yochanan, who says that it only applies to get and not to anywhere else. Gemara asks from the Mishnah, where it clearly says it applies to kedushin. Gemara asks first kedushin and then other loans. So the Gemara says Rav Abba as Rav Asi, it says that it applies to Kedushin. So the Gemara says that's different. Kedushin, there's a Gzeres HaKasav, the Yatzav HaHaisa that connects Kedushin to Gittin. It works by Gittin, so it works by Kedushin as well. Now, the logic of that should work by Gittin is since a woman can be divorced against her will, throwing it into her Rishus works because she doesn't have a say in the matter. However, if we're talking about someone else, he could protest and not allow his Rishus to work, and therefore it doesn't work for him. Now, Kedushin, because of the hekesh, Yatzav HaHaisa, it works by Kedushin as well. So we're asked, but it also said it works for repayment of a chayv. Right? We said in the Mishnah that if it lands closer to the lender and then it gets lost, it's his responsibility. It doesn't get paid again. So Gemara says, here we're referring to where the lender said, throw it to me and you will be patur automatically. Meaning he promised him that it shouldn't worry, doesn't matter what's going to happen, the obligation will be resolved by him throwing it. So Gemara says, well, if that's true, then what's the chiddush of the Mishnah? It makes no difference where it was. Maybe it's not considered to be thrown to him until it gets near him, but there's no chiddush. So Gemara says there is a chiddush. The chiddush is he didn't say and be patur, he said, throw it to me like the halacha of the get, meaning I'm applying the halachas of a get to you repaying me the loan. So Gemara says, still, what's the chiddush? The Mishnah says the same halacha applies as if it was a get, of course, that's what he said. He was willing to patur the guy. So Gemara says, no, you may say that he could say, Mishat anibach, I was just fooling, that's not a real thing. Kamash Malan, that if he said that, it counts. Gemara now brings two additional halachas. Halacha number one, number Kotz of Chizdo, says that if he sends her the get, and she's holding the get, however, he has a string, and he has a string wrapped around it, connected to it, he still has a string, it's connected to him by this string.